Hey guys, welcome back to Project Bodybuilding. This is going to be one of the absolute best comparisons I've done all year. Not only is this one of the most stacked comparisons that I could do, but it's a collaboration. Today's video is a collaboration with Supersetman. I'm sure if you watch my videos, you've heard of Supersetman. He's a much larger channel, but he was still kind enough to get me in on this challenge he's posing to other bodybuilding YouTubers. He's done his own challenge on his channel already, you can go check that out. Mark's Max Muscle has already done his video, and that one's out now, and now here is mine. But what's the challenge? The challenge of the video is a question from Supersetman. That question being, who was the best Mr. Olympia post Phil Heath? Since 2017, Phil's last Olympia, we've had 5 different winners. That's 5 different men hoisting that Sandow trophy in just 6 years, and that honestly isn't common. Since its creation in 1965, the Mr. Olympia has only been won by 17 individuals, and almost a third of them have won just since 2017. I think in a lot of ways we are in a big transition period in the bodybuilding world. We're leaving the bubble guts and the unaesthetic physiques of the 2010s behind and have really started a new mass with class era. And personally, I'm all here for it. But with the standard being a little fluid right now and the judges trying to reform what they want Mr. Olympia to look like, there have been a lot of title changes. But who had the best physique after Phil Heath? With each guy in this comparison today only winning 1 Olympia besides one competitor who has won 2, there really isn't a clear answer, hence the challenge. So in today's video, I'm going to try and determine who the best Mr. Olympia has been after Phil Heath. This includes Sean Roden, Mr. Brandon Curry, Big Ramy, Hadi Chupin, and the latest winner, Derek Lunsford. And we're going to be using all of their Olympia winning versions. This comparison is going to be absolutely stacked, and I want to do it justice, so it's going to be a long one. With that said, let's go ahead and cut this intro stuff and jump right into the video. If you guys like these types of videos and want to see more, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe while you're at it. This first pose, the front double bicep, is an amazing display of talent. You can take a look at every single guy here and see Olympia qualities in everyone. So this comparison is not going to be easy if all the poses are like this one, and I think they'll be very similar. Anyway, I want to preface this by saying no one in this pose is bad. No one is even close to average. Maybe not everyone could win, I still see some that are clearly ahead of the pack, but no one is less than extraordinary in this one. I actually want to jump to my winner first because he catches my eye every time I look at this photo. I think Brandon Curry actually wins this one hands down by having everything. This pose is so underrated for him. The entire version is. This 2019 Olympia version is my favorite version of Brandon Curry, and for good reasons. Ones we'll come to find throughout this comparison. But in this pose, I really do think he is one of the best out of all of these Mr. Olympias. Brandon has everything. Good arms, double check. Great arms, in fact. Easily the best on this stage. Best peaks, best fullness, best shape to the actual bis and tris, and that outline is crazy. Brandon is notorious for his undersized legs, and that is a major problem for him, especially in these more recent years, but with the 2019 Olympia version, I don't see many problems here. The sweep on his quads are pretty good, and the posing helps with that. The adductors fill in that inner thigh gap, and really the size is there. And Brandon doesn't need to have those big Ramy quads. Brandon's upper body is so wide and his waist is so small that he can get away with having slightly undersized legs. Now, are they the best legs on stage? Probably not. I'd like to see a touch more separation and maybe a little bit more size, but for Brandon's physique, they fit perfectly. Brandon is all about balance, and this version's lower body actually rounds out the pose quite nicely. Honestly, when you count for the quad sweep, that tight waist, his crazy lats, and the width of his upper body, he has the best X-frame on stage. He's not the biggest guy, but the silhouette is amazing. And when you're winning the arms too, how can you not win the entire pose? Now, in a battle for second, I have 3 guys in contention here, being Sean, Ramy, and Hadi. And that does push Derek back all the way to 5th since I don't like him as much as the others. His arms aren't the best. Honestly, I think he's tied for the worst arms in the pose. The upper body is great, but the lower body really throws me off. He's a lot like the Brandon Curry of today, he just does not have good balance. His upper body is so wide, too wide for the legs being this small. His upper body taper is good, but he can't finish the pose out when you go downstairs, which hurts him in creating a good solid X-frame. And I do say the upper body is good, but I actually have a nitpick, that being the lats. They're huge. I think they're too huge. It's like they're overdeveloped. They don't insert that low from the front either, so they have a weird shape to them. It's like 2 half circles under his armpits. They just don't flow into his waist too well. Still, the upper body is crazy even with that very small gripe. But with the worst arms and the most unbalanced silhouette slash X-frame, I do have him separated from the pack, and that means he's going to be last place. This leaves the last 3 gentlemen I mentioned a second ago. So out of Sean, Ramy, and Hadi, in terms of the arms, I'm going with Hadi. He is turning a little bit in this pic, but you can still see that he has great arms. He has the best shape out of the 3 with the best peaks, and they do look very hard. Next, I'd go with Ramy. Not much to say here, just a solid set of arms, no flaws, but Hadi's better peaks jumped out to me first. Then Then for Sean, I gotta put him in last out of these three guys in the arm department for basically just having Derek's arms but a little bit bigger. They're really smooth, but they are full, but with that, they don't have that much peak. Now going to the silhouette department, Sean makes up some good ground there. I mean, technically Ramy does have the best X-frame because of his quads, but that's a double-edged sword because there's no balance. The lack of balance in decent proportions is enough to have Sean in first for the outline. The tilt Sean is rocking is also a nice touch. It's a nice way to make this pose unique while not breaking the rules. Now to be fair, I wish Sean had carved up a little less here because with all due respect, his stomach looks a little full. It's just a food thing, we know it is, and he wasn't a spring chicken when he won his Olympia either, and being old doesn't help the stomach elasticity, but it's not the biggest flaw, definitely far from it, but it is a small detraction for me. Now the second best outline out of the bunch is Heath. Is he blocky? A little, but his physique flows together so much better than Ramy's, I think we can all agree there. So with Heath winning that outline over Ramy and having the best arms here out of the remaining three, I was very tempted to put him in second, and I honestly still could. I think third and second are very close actually, but I have Sean Roden going into the runner-up spot. Heath is the better bodybuilder, he's the more developed of the two, but Sean has the better physique because he's just more aesthetic. And to me, him and Brandon look the most like Mr. Olympia in this shot. The other guys look like great bodybuilders, but Sean and Brandon have that wow factor. They look the most polished. Those are the physiques you make trophies out of. Sean draws my eyes the most besides Brandon. And his arms aren't that bad. They're fairly poor for this comparison, but I do think they're a smidge better than Derek's. Even though their arms are basically the same, they do work better on Sean's physique. And as I mentioned, he's got the best outline of these remaining three guys. If you just want more mass and more completeness, Heath could be your guy. But I'm in awe of Sean and Brandon too, so those guys are going to lead the pack. Heath is taking third here and is close to Sean with that deciding factor being personal preference. This does leave Big Ramy in fourth. I'm just not a fan of his Frankenstein looking physique. He looks like he was put together in a lab and stitched together using body parts from other bodybuilders. Even Derek had better flow to his physique. Honestly, I knocked Derek for being unbalanced, but Ramy suffers the same problem, but for the opposite reason. He's too bottom heavy. But I think Ramy's separation is better in the quads compared to Derek, the arms are harder and overall just better, and he is bringing an okay flow in the upper body with the tightest waist I've seen on a guy this size. Ramy escapes the bottom position thanks to a little more polish compared to Derek. Moving on to the front lat spread, I again have to get Derek out of this conversation. His front double was still respectable, but he is so peculiar in the front lat. We know he has a good back, and if you don't know that, wait until the rear poses and you'll see how good it is. His lats are great, but they don't present well from the front. I think this is for a couple of reasons. One, his arms, they're too full, they're literally casting shadows and hiding some of his lats. The other main reason is his waist. Is it big? No. But when he's not pulling a vacuum, it doesn't appear near as small as it was in the front double. And combine this with the fact that he's not the widest guy shoulder to shoulder out there. In fact, out of these guys, he has the shortest shoulder to shoulder distance. All of these factors are taken away from what should be the best lat spread on stage. He probably has the best back in the world, but with all these flaws, you can't tell that from the front. He also has some other issues like the lack of lower and upper body balance yet again, and a big one for me this time around is the chest. This will be more apparent in one or two other shots, but his chest looks like two deflated breast implants. He doesn't have the hardness or maturity in this region, and I find it very distracting. With all these issues, Derek takes a clear last place on this one. Now, I am going to jump all the way up to first. I went back and forth on this one surprisingly. This is actually a rewrite. I had someone else winning this pose entirely, but it didn't feel right. I took a look at other angles of everyone and the posing videos of their respective years and took that into account, and I do think I'm making the right decision now. So I have Sean Roden taking the front lat spread. I didn't put him in first initially for a couple of reasons. Does he have the best lats? No. Does he have the best arms and delts? No. Does he have the thickest chest? No. But his level of completeness and polish changed my mind. Everyone has their flaws, but does Sean? No. I can't even really find a small one. He again just looks like what Mr. Olympia should be. His X-frame is great, Brandon is good, very exaggerated, but Sean does have a better set of wheels. They're actually the best on stage. Ramy is bigger, but when his quads get into freaky territory, that's not necessarily better. And even though Sean may not have the best of a lot of body parts, he's still good in many aspects. The lats aren't very good, but he's very wide. And his pecs are probably the second best. He's one of only two that show striations here. The arms and shoulders aren't the biggest, but he has good separation in these groups, and we've established that his legs are the best. Like I said, maybe he's not the best for body part, but he's taking the physique as a whole. He's near perfect. So he takes his first pose with the front lat spread. This leaves us with Ramy, Brandon, and Heath. And honestly, I was going back and forth on these guys on both of my attempts for picking a winner out of these guys. They all have flaws, but good elements too. Brandon literally looks like the letter X, but the legs somehow look weaker. This pick was taken from the finals at the 2019 Olympia, and I do feel he got worse there. But that's part of bodybuilding. In the front double, he beat Sean because his legs looked good there, but objectively speaking, they are very weak. He has good X-frame, but at the same time, he looks small in the legs. I think a lot of work is being done by his upper body. His chest is so thick and so striated, which is a nice touch, and the lats are very thick and insert very low. Honestly, he has the best upper body of the bunch. Even better than Sean, but you gotta average it out with the poor legs. Now, shifting focus to Ramy, I think he brings better balance in this shot. Am I a fan of the legs now? No, but at least in this shot, he looks a little wider up top to bring better balance. His lats are surprisingly good from this angle, considering he doesn't even have them nowadays. This is a pretty solid pose altogether. I like it more than his front double. And honestly, if you just wanted strictly bodybuilding qualities, you just wanted more mass and more development overall, he could be your winner pretty easily. I do think he beats Hottie for this reason. Hottie is good. I do like his legs more since they show more separation, and he is very wide shoulder to shoulder, and he measures up to Ramy quite well on the width aspect for being several inches shorter. But why not just choose Ramy if you're going to want a physique like Hottie's? Hottie's leaning into the bodybuilding realm more than someone like Sean is, so if you like that, why not just pick the bigger version of it with Ramy? That's how I see it. They're really similar, so when all things are equal and you're judging the open, bigger tends to be better. So I do have Ramy over Hottie, but I'm struggling to place Brandon. He has good bodybuilding qualities, he's very thick and very developed, but he also has a nice balance of aesthetics like Sean does. But then again, he does have that big flaw in the lower body. I think since he's kind of the best of both worlds, I don't want to put him behind Hottie, but I don't think he can beat Ramy. I'm going to give Brandon a happy medium spot for a happy medium physique. His upper lower body balance is off, but I like his upper body more than I like Hottie's entire physique. And that's because of the crazy proportions and those extra details like those chest fibers. His proportions up top are just unparalleled, but that can only get you so far when that's all you bring. If the legs were to present a little bit better like they did in the front double, I could have placed him second, maybe even first, but they just look too blurry. And with his wide stance, they look smaller. So after Sean, I have Ramy, Brandon, Hottie, and then Derek. In the side chest, I see about two tiers within the competition. Brandon and Ramy are in a tier of their own, while the back of the pack consists of Sean, Hottie, and Derek. Starting with that bottom tier, I do have Sean leading that group, which puts him in third. Now, I've seen other creators doing this challenge, and a lot of them were putting Sean way higher than I am. Don't get me wrong, I like his pose, but look at Sean, and then look at Brandon, and then look at Ramy. Sean doesn't have that extra level of thickness from the side and in the pecs. Those guys look huge, they're popping. Sean looks developed head to toe, but he doesn't have that level of thickness from the side. Like I said though, I really appreciate his pose. Sean can make any pose look like a work of art. He's so aesthetic even in a shot like the side chest, and he does still have some good elements. He has a great side leg. I think that's the best part of the pose for him actually. The level of detail is crazy. And up top, even though he doesn't have that freaky level of mass like Ramy or the 3D pecs, delts, and arms of Brandon, it doesn't mean he's not developed. He again isn't blowing you away in size, but nothing is missing. And the pecs are still fairly thick. Is he the craziest from the side? No. But the pose is complete, and again, he looks like a statue. His pose is so good that even though Hottie has better pecs, I gotta put him below Sean. Hottie is very wide shoulder to shoulder, and the pecs are thick and detailed. Sean is better in the side leg, but up top Hottie is carrying more mass and thickness. But what else can I say besides I just like Sean's pose more? In last, I have Derek. Now, he isn't getting this position because he's bringing a bad pose like the front lat spread, for example. Everyone in the shot is actually really good, but someone has to be last. Honestly, I think on a different day I could have Derek in front of Hottie, but I like Hottie's width and pecs more, which led me to put him over Derek. In the past though, I have gone back and forth on this one. Derek's chest looks pretty good here despite what we saw in the front lat. He still lacks the detail and the muscle maturity of the other guys. He just has that young muscle, but the pecs are still respectable. And the side leg is really good too. His legs present very well from the side, a lot better than they do from the front, and he's way more conditioned downstairs than he is up top from the front. He's super dry there. Derek has good areas. He could place over Hottie in my opinion, but not today. It's still a good pose, but someone has to take the bottom spot. Now jumping into that top two with Brandon and Ramy, I think this one is pretty close. Now I do think Ramy is a little shorter than he actually is though, and I do think it would make a difference, so let's break down this top two a little bit more. Now that we have Brandon and Ramy isolated and Ramy set to a little more correct height, we can pick these guys apart. Let's start bottom up. Ramy has the best side leg ever, in my opinion. I have no problem saying that. The mass is there, it's big Ramy after all, but the cuts and separation is usually a rarity in this amount of size. But Ramy is so peeled and so packed with detail in this area. You can tell where the quads, glutes, and hams all end and begin. He's got extra lines in the quads, and he's got some good glute striations as well. Now to be fair to Brandon, his legs do look okay here. They may look just okay okay from the front and the rear with this version, but from the side, his legs have always looked at least decent. Even today, they look like a solid set of wheels from the side. He's got glute, ham, and quad separation too, and there's a decent amount of size there compared to the front or the back, but there's still no comparison at the end of the day. Going up to the midsection, I have Brandon. This is kind of by default, he's the only one consciously flexing it, but to me, that's still an important win. A lot of guys, Big Ramy included, just don't think about it too much. But it's a nice detail, especially when your abs look good from this angle like Brandon's. Now, Ramy doesn't have a bubble gut, but I like the added polish that comes from better presentation, so this is a Brandon win. I think the delt is about even. Maybe Brandon can win on a little more detail, but Ramy is good and similar in both size and detail. Now in the arms, I'd give a slight win to Brandon just because he's a little bit fuller through the bi and tri. So really with a tie in the delt and at worst a tie in the arms for Brandon, he wins the upper limb area. Finally, let's go to the pecs. I think Ramy is more than respectable, but Brandon's are just a little too much for him to contend with. Honestly, with how round and bubbly Brandon is through the chest, this is kind of like a most muscular in this pose. Those pecs are just jutting out of his rib cage and he has an okay amount of fibers running through them. And speaking of details, he does have a lot of nice vascularity throughout the shoulders and chest region. Ramy's chest is still good though. He's got a ton of detail too and a lot of mass, but Curry's just popping a little bit more. Now with all of this said, I was going back and forth on this one for a while. This is really a coin flip. I can go with anyone. I can pick Brandon for the better pecs and the 3D muscle, or Ramy for more overall mass and thickness. Well, today I'm going with the latter and handing the side chest to Ramy. The level of thickness on Ramy, the extra size, and overall completeness are my reasons. Ramy is very close to just about every area, even the arms and delt. Brandon is better in the pecs, don't get me wrong, but Ramy's pecs are thick and detailed too. And Ramy is more complete when you consider everything. Like I said, he measures up well in the upper body, but his lower body is the freakiest I've seen. So even though Ramy may not be winning every area, he's still very, very good in every area, including the all-important pecs. And with that, he is more complete head to toe. And in terms of overall mass and thickness from the side, against Big Ramy, not many can stand a chance. So for those reasons, I'm giving a small win to Ramy in the side chest, his first win of the comparison. This pose, like the side chest, has a couple of clear tiers within the competition, making placing a bit easier. Brandon and Derek are the only ones who can place first. They're in a tier of their own quite easily. Everyone else is missing quite a few things compared to these guys. But honestly, even though Brandon and Derek are head and neck above everyone else, I do think Derek is pretty far ahead of Brandon. I think we could have seen this coming. There's been a lot of talk about Derek's back recently and how good it is. And I do think his back and honestly the entire pose can and will be in the Hall of Fame in the future. More than likely within the top 10 of all time. Brandon is very, very good though. When he won his Olympia in that first Arnold Classic, everyone commended him on his tremendous back. It's wide, it's thick, and it's 3D like the rest of his physique. But all that praise only extends so far. It's only applicable above the belt. Because in the lower half, we begin to see where Brandon earned his reputation for those poor legs. With this version, his quads were a lot better than in the past couple of years. They were still full and separated in those front shots and looked good from the side. But when you turn him around, he's really dropping the ball. The glutes and hams are undersized to straight up, and his lack of quad sweep from the rear makes the overall girth of his legs appear much weaker compared to how they look from other angles. Unfortunately for Brandon, this is the main area he loses the pose from. I honestly really like Brandon's back. It's very symmetrical, and his delts and bicep peaks are icing on the cake, but he's not bringing a complete pose. Derek's back is better, objectively, wider, more detailed, and he has a good lower body, easily better than Brandon's. Derek's glute striations are so deep, his legs look much bigger as a whole too. He has much wider quad sweep from the rear and the hams are more developed. With a better back and actually having a lower body, Derek wins his first pose. Derek's back is so good, and since the only one that can somewhat contend with him in the back is Brandon, but Brandon has no lower body, Derek wins this pose very easily. And like I said, these are the best two in the pose, and easily separable from the pack. This puts Brandon in the runner-up spot. He has the second best back easily, and that does pull a lot of weight for him. Even though he's very weak in the lower body, the next guys have poor backs, which is the most important part of the pose. Some of them are even missing more than just the back. These reasons will become more apparent as we discuss the other guys, but I do see Brandon as a clear runner-up. Next, I really only have one more tier, and that's the battle for last. That tier consists of Hadi and Ramy. I see them as pretty lackluster in this pose. With that said, I do think Sean escapes from this bottom tier. He's bringing a complete pose. The lower body is great. Honestly, he may have the best, most balanced lower body of the entire comparison. However, he does fall off a little bit in the back. He's not super wide, super thick, but he's decent. He's at least more complete and better than the last two. So because Sean doesn't fit into either category, he's not really good or he's not really bad, I'm going to put him in a nice happy medium with third. He doesn't excel in this pose, but he has a good enough back and a complete pose as a whole to land in the middle. Now getting to that bottom tier, both of these guys ended up here by having the worst backs. Hottie's rear double was never his strongest pose, but in 2020 where he won his Olympia, the version we're using today, his back was at its worst. He doesn't have the thickest back, and that's the major problem. But usually he's in top-notch condition, which helps the detail he does have be more visible. But in 2022, his strategy was to come in really full. It helped in some areas. He did win this year after all, but in the back, I think it hurt him. The back looks way too smooth. He doesn't have that etched lower back or those deep crevices like Brandon or Derek. The lower body is a bit better. He has some slight glute striations and the hamstrings are pretty conditioned, but this is far from the best lower body on stage. Now, Rami's problem in the back is well known by this point. It's that shallow mid to lower back. However, we are using the 2020 version. Were his lats and lower back starting to disappear? Yeah, but it's not the 2022 version where they're just completely gone. His lower back is poor, but he still has enough shape and fullness to make his back maintain some semblance of actually looking like a back. He does have some very nice V taper in the back despite his retreating lats, and even though Rami doesn't have a lower back to speak of, the upper back is still okay. It's far from the best upper back on stage, but he still does have defined traps, rear delts, rhomboids, teres, and so on. Rami has more detail in his upper back than Hottie does in his entire back, which is a big win for Rami. And I do prefer Rami's lower body. The quads are facing the rear, so they don't look as grotesque here. Then the glutes are sporting more striations than Hottie, and Rami's hamstrings are pretty solid. Some of you will chime in and say, what about the horns and the glutes? I see them, but they were much worse in later versions. He's already in the back two spots anyway. He's already losing this pose. Stuff like this isn't that bad as missing lats. And if we're being fair, Hottie has a lump in his right glute especially. Derek has them, and honestly, his are the worst out of the entire pose. Here for Rami, I just don't find them as big of a deal. If I wasn't really scrutinizing these guys, I may not have even noticed. His quads are worse in my opinion. They're always apparent from the front, and I'm always focused on them. I can't miss them. Anyway, I don't think it's a huge deal, especially considering Rami's already so low anyway. Even factoring them in, I think he still beats Hottie. Hottie's back is way too smooth and underdeveloped looking for me. Rami's lower body is better, and with his decent upper back, his back is better as a whole to me. So they're going to round out this pose with a 4th place finish for Rami and a last place finish for Hottie. The second back pose becomes a whole lot more competitive. The only one that I couldn't see an argument for first is Sean. Sean's lower body is again great, but that back isn't his strong point. In fact, it's his weakest point. I think this could have been a lot better for him if he hit the pose differently. He should have bent at the pelvis a bit more and tilted back. It would have made his waist look smaller and probably could have brought out a little more width. Those two changes would have been a considerable net gain for him in overall taper and width. But he's leaning forward a lot in the torso, and it makes it more of a trap spread than a lat spread. Honestly, this is still an okay pose though. This would not be out of place in most recent Olympia lineups. But against the best of the past couple of years, he's the weak link. Now, like in the front double, I think everyone has an argument for first. Some are stronger than others though. The next one on the chopping block for me is Rami, which I'm sure will confuse some people. Is he wide? Yeah, but we saw this in the rear double. He doesn't have lats, so this is kind of by default. He looks so wide because shoulder to shoulder, he's just a big dude. But look at that mid to lower back. You can even see where the lats insert. You can even see it with Sean, but not Rami. But nonetheless, with his upper back and shoulder width, he is still wide, regardless of where that width may be coming from. But that lack of lats hurts him when creating a good taper. I look at two main things in this pose, width and taper. Rami has width, but the taper is very poor. Worst taper of the bunch, actually, and when you look at someone like Derek or Hottie, you can see they just draw your attention more because they have that very pronounced V taper. Rami isn't quite a V, he's sort of a U that's kind of stretching at the top. With the shallow mid to lower back and the lack of taper, he just looks weird to me again. I'm trying to put my finger on it, but I don't know if those are exactly the reasons, but nonetheless, they still detract from his pose for me. Still, Rami has good things going for him. He's still wide, don't get me wrong, and he has a solid lower body. I do think he could beat my third place in the shot, but I don't see him placing much higher than that. Anyway, who is my third place? Well, that's going to be Brandon Curry. Now, like I said, I do think Big Rami could beat him, mainly because Brandon's lower body looks absolutely abysmal in this shot. It looks even worse here than it did in the last pose somehow. There's no real size in the quads again, and the glutes are still underdeveloped. The hamstrings are still in, but I wish they were beefier. Yet again, he has the worst lower body in the pose easily. Brandon is lucky his back is so good. He may not be the widest guy since he's structurally one of the smaller ones on stage, but he has a crazy taper. His lats are wider, and his waist is super tight, which makes him look like a comic book character. And he has some good thickness and detail. Those traps are two huge mountains, and he shows off other good upper back details while maintaining good width through the lats. He's not turning this into a trap spread like Sean was. Overall, I was very impressed with Brandon's back. It's just as great as the rear double, but unfortunately he fails to bring a complete pose because he's missing half the body. So as good as his back is, I do feel that his ceiling is third. Could he get beat by Rami? Sure. But I was more impressed with Brandon's crazy proportions, so he gets to take a third on this one. And once again, it is down to 2 now, and this is going to ruffle some feathers. I don't have Derek in first. I know, I think it's close, but I have Hadi winning this shot. A lot of you are going to say, how? Hadi was so low in the rear double, how does he jump all the way up to winning the next back pose? Well, we're looking for different things. For overall width, it's no contest. Hadi is wider shoulder to shoulder than Derek, so that was an advantage he already had going into this pose, but he's really filling out those lats as well. I don't think anyone is going to argue that Hadi has at least width over Derek. When it comes to overall taper, I think it's pretty close because although Derek's lats aren't as wide, he does have a pretty tight waist. But Hadi is creating just as much taper by forging that width. I'll go ahead and call this area a draw. Now in terms of thickness and detail, I'd give Derek a small victory. Is this the most important area? No, but it is a bonus for Derek. He has more pronounced traps and other upper back muscles. But honestly, Hadi has some okay detail too. He has more than he did in the rear double where he was just completely flat. Hadi's erectors are clearly visible and tie in nicely to his traps. He's not as detailed as Derek, but there is some good detail in Hadi's back. Going down to the lower body, I do think Derek gets another slight win. Hadi looks a little better here than he did in the rear double though. His hamstrings are a little more pronounced and I do think he stacks up equally to Derek in that regard. But Derek's glutes are cheese graters and Hadi nor anybody else on the stage can compete with those. And with equal hams at worst, Derek takes the lower body. So Derek does win some elements. I had him winning at first, but I did change my mind. And every time I've had a comparison involving these two, I've gone back and forth. However, width is the most important thing, and that's Hadi's area all day long. The other areas are important, but with a solid win in the width department, can those other small wins make up for it? Not to me. If they were bigger wins, maybe. But the lower body on Hadi is still good, the level of detail is okay, and the taper is about equal. Hadi wasn't losing majorly in any one area while winning the most important one. So I think he gets a surprising narrow victory over Derek in the rear lat spread. The side tricep is a very underwhelming pose for everyone. I'm quite surprised, but taking a look at everyone, I'm not jumping to pick a winner. I'm not saying there aren't decent poses, but there aren't stellar ones. There aren't any poses that scream, that one right there is Mr. Olympia. I do want to start with the delinquent out of the lineup though, that being Sean Roden. Sean was one of the first ones to popularize doing this pose this way, and he was the best to do it too. This pose is terrific for him. He thrives on those details he has in the front, so if he can show them off, he's going to. The midsection is ripped, that's Sean's calling card, I don't need to tell you about that. The pecs are also looking really full, which is a nice touch. And going downstairs, the quads are great. I failed to mention this in the first two front poses, but we'll see this more in the next pose, but Sean's quads are terrific. They may be the best set of wheels back to front out of all of these guys. Those quads are just as ripped as the abs, sporting that elusive feathering. So he's got terrific elements, and even though I really shouldn't be talking about them because they're not relevant, I did anyway, because Sean's pose deserves recognition. However, you guys probably know what I'm going to say, this is not a side tricep. Notice how I talked about the quads, not the side leg as a whole, and I didn't even mention the tricep because you can't see much. He's downplaying that tricep for reasons we'll see in a second and shifting the primary focus to how good he looks from the front. However, this is breaking the rules. We want to see everyone hit the same pose for two reasons. One, we need to compare apples to apples and we want all the poses to be the same. And two, we have these poses for a reason. Some guys will do better in the front poses, others will look better in the side poses. That's not a flaw, that's by design. We want the most well-rounded physiques, so we need to see the physiques from all types of different angles. This is breaking the rules because you're getting rid of one of those angles. There are two front shots, two rear shots, two side shots, and two extra shots that show the physiques from the front but for different criteria. Downplaying one of those is like throwing your worst class out of your GPA. This is actually why colleges and other higher ups care about your GPA anyway. They want to see how well-rounded of a student you are, and that includes your highs and your lows. Sean is not that thick from the side or that big in the tris, so he's tossing out his worst grade and duplicating his best grade by doing what is basically another front shot. It's not fair despite how much I love this pose. So I have to knock him if we use this pose for not showing those side elements. But honestly, when he does do the pose properly, even then I'm placing him last. He has the skinniest, smallest tricep, and the upper body width and thickness leaves much to be desired. The side leg is still great like it was in the side chest, but the two elements I mentioned already sealed his fate. Again, his first pose was great. My favorite of the bunch, so if we were just picking favorites, he wins easily. But we aren't. And that apples to apples comparison is a good example of why he chose to do the original pose in the first place. Next, I'm going to put Derek in fourth. All the triceps from here on out are very similar in terms of size and whatnot, so we gotta start looking at other elements. Derek's side leg is good. He can't get first because he's standing next to Big Rami, but I would still put him in second for the overall side leg. Very dry, very detailed. Derek's tricep, like I said, no one is stellar, but he's pretty good. The pecs are nothing to write home about, and neither is the overall thickness from the side. I can forgive that though. What's really derailing him is the midsection. He's got the worst one on the stage, and it's not because because he's the weakest, he's just outright pretty poor. There's a little bit of stomach distension at the bottom and the abs are very, very blurry. When Big Ramy has the tighter, more detailed midsection, you know you messed up. This is a big mark on his pose, and when everyone is similar in terms of the overall strengths, it's really who has the least flaws and the least notable ones. Derek's midsection is quite a big one for me, putting him in 4th place. A good midsection pays off because that's what's landing Hottie in 3rd over Derek. Hottie and Derek are similar in a lot of ways. The side legs are similar in terms of size, but Derek still wins with a touch more detail. The pecs and the thickness from the side are similar because again, nothing too substantial there for either guy. Now on the tricep and really the arm as a whole, including the delt, I gotta give Derek the slight edge. But Hottie's midsection puts him ahead. That win in the tricep isn't enough to make up for Derek's big flaw. So Hottie had less flaws, a decent tricep, and a good midsection, which is enough for 3rd. Finally, between Brandon and Ramy, I can honestly go back and forth. That freaky side leg returns from the side chest for Big Ramy. It's again, no contest there. Ramy's side leg is insane. It's the best part of the pose for him, in fact. His midsection is okay. I wish he flexed it harder, but it's still tight. No bubble gut to be found here. Brandon is fine here too. Nothing super crazy like Hottie's, but solid. Ramy honestly could have beat Brandon here if he just flexed harder though. If you've seen his obliques before, you know they're crazy, but you gotta be able to present that, and he's not. In the pecs, I do prefer Brandon. Brandon's are a little bit fuller and pop out more. Now on the triceps, you have to go with Brandon. But if only Ramy had locked his elbow out. And I look for other pictures to swap in here, he just didn't have that mobility or knowledge, I guess, to fully lock that arm out. This would have been another area he won, I believe. He could have won that tricep if he flexed it to the best of his abilities. So Brandon wins the tricep, but the bicep and delt are Ramy's. He's surprisingly thicker than Brandon. So Brandon and Ramy both win some elements, and to be fair to Ramy, like in the side chest, I think Supersetman could have made him just a little bit taller. He's squatting down, yes, but if you look at the heads, Ramy's head should be a bit bigger, and if anything, he's smaller. I think this would help Ramy because the tricep would look bigger, and he'd overall look thicker from the side. So let's isolate these two real quick for a better view. I'm definitely glad I did this and gave them a second look because I was prepared to give Brandon the nod here for first. But I'm going with Big Ramy for now. I think this taller version of Big Ramy really shows how thick he is to the tricep. I think he does bring enough detail and size even though he's not fully flexing it. But the main selling point for me was how thick Ramy looks. When he's the right height, Ramy just carries so much mass. Even though Brandon has a lot of pop and fullness, Ramy is just bringing so much more mass. He is Big Ramy after all. Still, I think Brandon brings a very strong pose. His tricep is good, and like I said, he has a lot of fullness and roundness, which does help from the side. But that wicked raw mass, that side leg, and the good enough tricep is just enough for me to put Ramy in a very close first. The abs and thighs comes down to two guys, and I think we all know who those guys are. We'll get to them in a second, but let's get the rest of the competition out of the way. Derek again is going to have to take the back spot on this. I'm so glad Supersetman didn't use his vacuum pose in this shot. I know a lot of casual fans see an open guy do a vacuum and immediately put that guy as the winner. But this isn't classic and you can't do a vacuum and open. I'm okay with it in the first two front shots maybe, and maybe even as a variation of your abs and thighs, but at some point you need to hit the real deal. It's exactly the same things as I said about Sean's side try. You can't hide the element of the pose we want to see. Derek usually pulls a vacuum in the shot to do just that. Because take a look at the actual abs and thighs. To put it bluntly, this is not Olympia caliber. Without his vacuum, I'd argue that Derek's waist isn't actually impressive. I wouldn't even call it small or trim. And the abs themselves are fairly poor. Some of them have good separation between them, others blur into each other. He just lacks a lot of development. The quads are okay, but they aren't sporting that much detail. I think his entire physique really suffers from immature muscle. He needs more time to get that deep separation in a lot of places in his physique. The quads are one area that this needs to happen in, and the abs are one too to a lesser extent. So overall, he doesn't have that much taper even with those wide lats because his waist is looking bigger, and the abs and quads are very underwhelming. But don't worry down there, Derek, because Brandon is coming to join you down there in this bottom tier. Brandon's pose is fairly underwhelming too, but not as nearly bad as Derek's. I actually strongly prefer Brandon's quads to Derek's, which I can't believe I'm saying. They may be a little smaller, but the quality is there. They're more separated, and Brandon even has some very slight feathering in some areas. Brandon's legs have been hit or miss throughout this comparison. He did really well from the side and in the front double. I do think his showing here is closer to that front double than how he looked in the back poses, for example. The sweep is really good by his standards, and they don't look blurry. But Brandon really let us down in the abs. He has more taper than Derek. Brandon's waist is much smaller, and his lats flow a lot better down into his waist, but the separation in the abs themselves just isn't there. You can still see the entire six-pack outline, but he needs to flex harder or do something because there needs to be more. Derek's abs are probably more defined, but I still don't think he's winning the midsection. I actively dislike Derek's pose a lot. Brandon's close is closer to mediocre when you consider everything, but he's not offending me like Derek is. Besides better abs, Brandon has better legs, better taper, and a better midsection as a whole, so I gotta give Brandon this shot above Derek. To round out the back spots of this list, I have Big Ramy in third. He's actually the first one to bring both a good set of thighs and a decent set of abs. Is he a little thick in the waist? Sure, but let's keep in mind he is 300 pounds. And given how his lats taper into his waist, it's not the worst. Derek again should be beating him in this regard, but he doesn't. Ramy's taper is okay considering how large he is, and the abs themselves are the best so far. For a 300-pound mass monster, this is pretty impressive. His obliques are close to getting truly diced, and the abs have good separation and the good type of blockiness too. This is truly a developed core. He's a bit blocky, and the next two guys have more development, but the guys below Ramy didn't even have this. So what about the quads? Not my cup of tea yet again, but they have what we ask for. They're separated and big. I would just say a little too big. But I'm not going to harp on him too much because like I said, he's the only guy we've talked about so far to actually bring both elements and bring good elements at that. And really the next two guys are so far ahead in the pack, there's no need to beat Ramy down. His ceiling is third in the shot because now we have some of the best abs and thighs poses of the post-Phil Heath era. Like I said, we all know who this was going to come down to, and we have a little bit of a battle. Sean and Hottie are just light years ahead of anyone I can think of, not just in this lineup, but in recent years. Breaking it down, starting with the legs, I do prefer Sean. Like I said earlier in the video, Hottie was really trying to come in full at the show. That helped him in other areas like overall leg size, but not detail. We've definitely seen his legs sharper before. They're definitely pretty sharp by modern standards, but by Hottie standards, not quite. We're used to seeing that paper thin skin and tons of feathering. And I did say that coming in fuller did help the overall size on his quads and the sweep, but Hottie didn't have the widest quads to begin with, so he can only do so much there. He was never going to beat Sean in overall leg size and sweep no matter how full he came in. Sean just has very naturally wide legs, and he has more detail easily. He has that elusive feathering in his quads in multiple areas, which is something usually only Hottie has. And credit where it's due, Sean's calves are great. When you have a good set of quads and add a good set of calves, they do complement each other a lot and help create a nice overall balanced look. Sean not only has the only pair of calves on the stage, but he has a good pair in general. Anyway, with better details and more size, Sean wins the first aspect of the pose. But going up, I'm about to commit blasphemy because I do think Hottie's actually better in the abs. Hottie has a bit more of that chunkiness to his abs, which is a good thing, and he has more detail in the obliques. So yeah, Hottie is ahead here, but let's not forget how good Sean is. Sean doesn't have any flaws in his midsection development. I just like Hottie's a bit more. Sean's abs are like a 9.8 out of 10, and Hottie's are like a 9.9. But I do think for the overall taper of the upper body, I gotta go with Sean. Hottie's just a bit too blocky. Really, Sean's overall execution is top notch, and he does prevail over Hottie in that aspect. So I have each gentleman winning either major aspect of the abs and thighs pose, but if you place Sean anywhere other than first, you are lying to yourself. Hottie is a little more developed in the midsection, sure, but Sean is right there. Honestly, most people will even have Sean over Hottie in the abs. And in the quads is a different story. Sean clearly won, and I don't think anyone is going to argue that. Sean had a more convincing win in the quads over Hottie than Hottie had over Sean in the abs. So with better quads and terrific abs and just the complete statuesque pose yet again, I gotta give this pose to Sean. Everyone saw that coming. Speaking of predictable results, in the most muscular, there's no surprise here. In first place, I do have Big Ramy. He's not the most detailed of the bunch, but he's certainly the biggest. Everything about him is huge, and he still manages to keep a tight and detailed midsection on top of that. It's not a perfect pose, again I wish he had more detail, but for the most muscular pose, I don't think anyone fits that description better than Big Ramy. Now I want to do one more jump all the way down to the bottom for one last time, and it seems Derek always gets the short end of the stick when I go immediately to last place. But I'm putting him here yet again. This pose is just not good. Now, Supersetman did use Derek's crab variation, which I do think is his worst variation of the most muscular, but his others aren't good either. Somehow the crab is just worse, and the flaws he does have are fairly consistent between all the poses. His delts and chest are too soft, it throws off the entire pose, that's the first thing, and in his crab variation, his arms are so skinny. Compare them to Brandon's arms and delts in his own crab pose. That's what good delts and arms look like. 3D, round, bubbly. Derek doesn't have the size nor the hardness yet to make this pose work in this area, nor in the chest. Going down to the midsection, it is yet again underwhelming, and then finally the legs are okay. Not super noteworthy, but they somehow become the highlight of this pose when the upper body is that poor. This pose is just all sorts of messed up, and I have to say it again, just not Olympia caliber. He's notably behind all the rest. Now between the last three, Brandon, Sean, and Hottie, I like things about each of them. Brandon's crab is just crazy, he looks stacked. The legs are downplayed in the crab variation, which is honestly a good thing for Brandon. But they still look fairly good here, still pretty full. The midsection is still tight, he isn't using this pose pose as an excuse to let it go, and he honestly has more ab separation here than in the actual abs and thighs. And like I said when discussing Derek's pose, Brandon's arms and delts are huge and full. He's got good peaks on the bis, good sweep on the tris, and the delts are fully developed. All 3 heads. The traps are also tremendous. And the pecs are still very thick and full. We saw that in the actual side chest. Even though Brandon isn't as tall and as imposing as Sean nor conditioned as Hottie, I do think he fills out his frame quite well. And he may not be the most detailed on stage, but he does still bring enough. Pound for pound, he is probably the second most muscular guy next to Ramy, and his crab shot is just textbook. This puts Brandon in a comfortable runner-up spot. And third, I can go either way. Hottie is honestly probably a little more muscular than Sean, but I prefer Sean's pose. And when it's close in muscularity, since Sean is taller than Hottie, it negates a little bit of Hottie's win in that department because Sean is going to look just as impressive and just as massive. Hottie brings good details, especially in terms of chest striations, but Sean has good details too. But really, as I said, I just like Sean's pose more. My focus is drawn to him the most out of everyone, actually. He looks very aesthetic, which isn't enough to win the pose. I couldn't have him above Ramy, for example, just because he simply looks better, but to some extent, it does help. I think being taller and being completely developed would make him quite massive looking, even though he is one of the least muscular guys on stage. Overall, I just like him more, plain and simple. I think Hottie may win more objectively, but out of the lineup, my eyes are just drawn to Sean. He has good detail and is complete and fully developed, even if he isn't the biggest. So with that, rounding out this comparison, that puts Hottie in 4th and Sean in 3rd. And that concludes the pose by pose portion of this comparison. I'll show you guys my scorecard, but keep a couple things in mind. 1, these placings were so close that I could have switched them around a lot, so take the actual scores with a grain of salt. And 2, we won't just be considering the mandatories for this video. The mandatories are very important, but not everything. Anyway, here is my full scorecard. And I was fairly surprised at the results of the comparison round. I had Brandon Curry winning this round by 1 point. Right behind him was Big Ramy with 20 points, and then in a fairly close third was Sean with 23 points. In 4th was Hottie with 26 points, and in a pretty clear last place I had Derek. So those are the results of the comparison round, but I want to take a look at these guys through a couple of different lenses. But before we move on, I do want to streamline this comparison from here on out, and I do have to drop Derek from this comparison. He only won 1 pose, but he was so far behind everyone else. He had good back poses, but he had some outright bad poses. The abs and thighs, the most muscular, and front lat spread were all abysmal, and some of the other poses he still managed to place in last, despite bringing okay poses for those. He easily had the most flaws, and depending on which ones we're talking about, pretty substantial flaws at that. And honestly, if you asked me, he wasn't even the winner of the 2023 Olympia, so there's that. Now, it is down to 4, and I really did want to keep Hottie in, but after dropping Derek and redoing the scoring without him, Hottie is too far behind to justify his inclusion beyond this point. After rescoring, Hottie was distantly behind everyone by at least 5 points, so he's out. And now we have what I believe are the 3 best Mr. Olympias from the post-Phil Heath era. And after redoing the scoring, it's still close. They're all just 2 points behind each other. And I thought about potential corrections I could make, but for the most part, I didn't want to change anything. And any pose I could have changed was usually followed by a pose I could have changed for someone else in someone else's favor, which just reset the score back to baseline. Now, like I said, this is just one component I want to use to determine the winner. I don't do this in every comparison, but I wanted to make this one very thorough. So I have 3 categories I want to look at, and the mandatories are just one of them. So I'm going to rank everyone 1 to 3 in this round, and we'll move on to the next round. So Brandon gets a point for winning, Ramy gets 2 points for second, and Sean gets 3 for third. Now, the next round I want to do is just what I call overarching aspects. What are those aspects? Well, they're the 3 main bodybuilding criteria: shape/aesthetics, conditioning, and muscularity. Those mandatories are really hyper-focused in on someone's physique and how they look at the time. But I want to look at everyone through this broad lens next. And these are the 3 main things we look for when it comes to judging physiques with a wide lens. In terms of muscularity, I don't think I really need to tell you Big Ramy wins, but between Brandon and Sean, I'm kind of torn. Brandon is very huge in the upper body, but the legs let us down. Sean is less muscular than Brandon pound for pound, but he's more complete with a better lower body, which is a big component here. Sean's added height also makes him look very impressive, even though Brandon should be more impressive since he's more muscular. Overall, I gotta give a tie here. I like Brandon's 3D muscle bellies, and he's so huge up top, but Sean's completeness and height do a lot to make the ground up. Moving on to the shape category, it's another no-brainer. I gotta put Sean in an easy first. I think it's easy to see Brandon in second, and Ramy is in an easy third. How many times did I say Sean looked like a statue? A lot. And I did say that about Brandon too, but a lot less. And inversely, I was criticizing Ramy heavily for having a Frankenstein-like physique. Now, in terms of condition, Sean definitely leads this pack as well. Brandon and Ramy had good conditioning, but it did lack in some areas for them, including separation and other things. Sean had details everywhere and had the paper-thin skin look, and this was for even in tricky areas like the glutes and hams. Now, I went back and forth on this one as to who to put in second, but I did decide on putting Ramy here. These guys' condition is very similar, but Ramy was drier and had more overall separation. Brandon's legs legs were a little too blurry at times. Ramy had the better ab separation, more glute striations, and drier hams. So since Ramy was drier and had more overall separation, despite these guys being in very similar spots in terms of conditioning, I'm giving the edge to Ramy. So now for these overall qualities, I'm going to add up the placings, and just like in the first round, the lowest score wins. Sean won the overall physique qualities with 4 points, with Ramy and Brandon behind in second and third respectively, but just within 1 point of each other. Now we're on to my last round, overall flaws. Some people can really use the mandatories to hide their flaws, so we need to judge everyone's physique as a whole to see who's missing the most. Let's start with Brandon's first because his flaw is obvious. It's the entire lower body, especially from the rear. Now, I did say flaw and not flaws when it comes to Brandon because other than that, I don't really feel he has many other issues. I could maybe say conditioning, he was blurry in some areas, so there's that. But honestly, even though on paper he only has one flaw, it's a big one. The lower body is half the body. The quads are okay sometimes, and from the side they look decent, but from the back they were awful. He only placed high in the back poses because his upper body was so great. But if it wasn't, you can believe he'd be getting dead last in those poses. I hit on Derek for not having Olympia caliber poses and body parts, but in my opinion, a Mr. Olympia needs a lower body. And Brandon's is fairly lackluster. When you go pose by pose, he can get over a lot because the quads were okay in 2019 and from the side the legs presented well, but zooming out and examining the physique as a whole has you notice a huge disparity with the lower body. It's just one flaw, but it's quite big. Now let's talk about Sean. I'll say this up front, he's the closest to flawless. The only thing I think is big enough to make the cut is the back. It was fairly developed, but for being Mr. Olympia, it was a little shallow. But yeah, that's basically it. And finally, Big Ramy has a couple of issues. He also has a depth problem in the back, but his is really only in the mid to lower back, since this was when his lats were starting to disappear. The other flaw I wanted to highlight was lack of balance. At times, I describe the quads as grotesque. The quads definitely don't match the calves, and his lower body as a whole is way too big to match the upper body. It doesn't hurt him as a bodybuilder, but his physique is hindered by the lack of flow and balance. He ends up looking like a Frankenstein bodybuilder in several poses. So I think Brandon's flaw is the worst overall. It's the entire half of the body, so he's getting last in this round. Sean has to get first though regardless because as I said, he's nearly flawless. This puts Ramy in a default second. And those are the 3 rounds I wanted to go through to make this a complete comparison. I thought about including posing, but let's be honest, would the actual judges care about it? I highly doubt it. But there's no contest if I did include it. Sean would be first, he's a master at presentation, and he already looks like a work of art. Brandon's routine was also very good, still very artistic, he'd get an easy second. And Ramy gets third for just not putting in that much effort. I did watch all of them including his, and his was okay, especially for a mass monster, but the other 2 guys are just on another level. Will I include this category? No, but credit where it's due to both Sean and Brandon for good, thoughtful routines. Anyway, after adding up everyone's score from each round, it was still very close. Sean does fall into first with 5 points, Brandon is second with 6, and Ramy was third with 7. These results make a lot more sense, and they're ones I do feel are accurate and do reflect a very possible scenario that we might have seen if all of these versions stepped on stage together. Ramy and Brandon, I can have switched around. I do agree with having Brandon above Ramy, but I am biased. I love Brandon's 2019 physique. If you want great shape and those 3D round muscle bellies, you're going to agree with me and have Curry in second. However, if you're going to say that Brandon is not complete based on the lower body, which I do agree with by the way, and you just want a freak and a mass monster, then Ramy is your guy. Me personally, I do prefer a nicer looking physique, and Brandon was the best out of these guys in the upper body. He carried a lot of mass through that upper body, and the quads looked okay at times. He brought a good level of mass, but a decent dose of shape. Ramy was arguably more complete, but his physique's polish and aesthetics left a lot to be desired. So who does this leave in first but none other than Sean Roden? Like when he dethroned Phil Heath, he didn't win the most mandatories. Phil won the 2018 Olympia on mandatories. I've said this and the head judge has said this. And Sean wasn't the most muscular guy then in 2018 nor on this stage. I don't even know if I put him as the second most muscular on this stage. But Sean's physique is one of the most flawless to win the Mr. Olympia. I don't believe he was the best bodybuilder. He hasn't built the most muscle, but he has built a completely developed physique and a physique that looks like Mr. Olympia. Some body parts are more developed than others, sure, but nothing was severely lagging behind or overpowering other parts of his physique. His condition was the best in this comparison, and so were his aesthetics. Nothing was out of place, nothing was missing, everything was developed, and his presentation allowed everyone to marvel at what he had created. To finally answer Supersetman's challenge and the question who was the best Mr. Olympia after Phil Heath, I have to say Sean Roden. One of my personal favorite physiques, one of my favorite bodybuilders, the one to finally dethrone Phil Heath, and the one that created one of the most flawless physiques of all time. Well, that's going to do it for today's video. I do want to apologize to you guys and Supersetman for how long this took, but I really wanted to deliver you guys the most high quality analysis I could, so I knew this was going to take some time. And if you look at the timestamp right now, you can begin to see how this took me so long. So sorry about that, but I do want to thank Supersetman as well. He was going to reach out to me for this challenge, but I got to him first, and he was happy to have me collaborate with him and do the Supersetman challenge. And I was very humbled, honored, and thankful to do so. I've only been in this community space for about a year, so for my videos and work to be recognized already by much larger channels is amazing. This was definitely a good idea, and I was happy to be a part of it. And I definitely want to do more collabs like this one and other various projects with others in the future, so stay tuned for those. So again, thank you Supersetman for getting me in on this one. I hope I did it well. But finally, it is time to end this long video. If you guys like these types of videos and want to see more, go ahead and hit that like button and the subscribe button too to stay up to date on all of my future videos. And by the way, I'm not the only one to do the Supersetman challenge, so for all the other challenge videos I've seen, I've went ahead and linked them in the description. I'm not too sure if this is all of them, so my apologies if I missed yours, but for all the videos I could find, they're down in the description. By the way, if you guys are looking for any high quality supplements, be sure to head over to armsracenutrition.com. Arms Race is bringing out some great new products in 2024, and all of their current formulas on their current products are all top notch. If you guys are interested in purchasing any high quality supplements from Arms Race Nutrition, be sure to use code PROJECT10 to get 10% off your entire order. That's code PROJECT10 at armsracenutrition.com. With all of this said, I want to thank you guys for watching. Here's to the new year, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Gotta get that Lexi, yeah.